Winter warriors fight not just an armed enemy. They battle against the fury of Mother Nature, crippling frostbite, starvation, and malfunctioning equipment. From the devastating Russian winter, the Battle of the Bulge, the frigid mountains of Korea, and the icy waste of Alaska, the danger of battle pales against the struggle to survive the cold. Now, Winter Warriors on Modern Marvels.
Today's armies train soldiers to fight in the coldest temperatures on Earth, preparing them for the unique challenges of winter warfare. In battles fought in freezing weather, soldiers will suffer warfare at its worst, fighting not just a savage enemy, but murderous weather and temperatures that regularly drop to 30 degrees below zero. Frostbite sets in on immediate exposure to fierce cold. It can lead to gangrene and the loss of extremities. For a soldier unprotected in sub-zero conditions, the cold can kill the body almost as fast as a well-aimed bullet.
In the morning, we'd go around as 2 or 3 bodies of dead American soldiers that just froze to death.
If you were in your sleeping bag, you were all right, but if you lost that sleeping bag, it was just like you'd be dead.
If you tried to do anything requiring any manual dexterity beyond pulling a trigger, you sooner or later had to remove the gloves, and your fingers would freeze instantly.
Combat is combat. But when you see someone that has been disabled and you don't know where to take them and you have no means of evacuating them at that time, and with those elements you know they're going to freeze to death.
At some point, perhaps minus 10 degrees Fahrenheit, everything else loses significance in comparison to trying to stay warm. When it gets to minus 25 degrees Fahrenheit, the individual soldier is only concerned with simply staying alive.
Throughout history, soldiers have found themselves waging campaigns in freezing weather. Almost always, they were caught ill-prepared with clothing and equipment that was no match for the icy extremes. In these bitter conditions, more men would die from the cold than from wounds inflicted by the enemy. Even if a soldier could find a way to stay warm, freezing temperatures could still cost him victory. Weapons and vehicles froze up and ceased to work. Foxholes were impossible to dig in the frozen ground. Mobility through thick snow was severely cut down for the foot soldier and required much more effort. The sound he made advancing in the snow could be heard at a distance. Surprising the enemy was all but impossible. In fact, before the modern age, actual winter warfare was relatively unknown. When cold weather began to set in, military planners would lead troops home for the winter to conserve their strength until the spring. In the winter of 1777, bad weather dealt a savage blow to General George Washington's Continental Army. After suffering defeat to the British, who moved in to occupy Philadelphia in September, Washington withdrew to Valley Forge, some 30 miles outside the city, to establish winter quarters. Local diaries record that temperatures in that period fell to a low of 8 degrees Fahrenheit, well below freezing. Although this winter was moderate compared to later winters suffered by the Army, heavy snowfall at Valley Forge compounded the misery of insufficient food and bad living conditions.
It was a very difficult time for our early patriots. Living in huts, perhaps 12 to a hut, jammed in to provide warmth. They were unable to stay warm. They didn't have the shoes that would protect their feet, unable to go out and forage.
Food was scarce. In some cases, soldiers were driven to steal from their comrades out of sheer desperation. Those weakened by hunger easily succumbed to disease.
Some 3,000 men died during that winter. And you compare that to perhaps a total loss of 6,000 or 7,000 people killed in action in the Revolutionary War, you can see the impact of disease and cold.
Knowing the obvious dangers of leading men to war without adequate food and shelter, why did one of the greatest military strategists in history sacrifice his army to the ferocious Russian winter in one of the most catastrophic campaigns ever fought? On June 23, 1812, Napoleon led his 600,000-strong army into Russia to attack the opposing Tsarist forces that totaled only 180,000. He was confident of a quick victory.
His plan was to move forward, quickly engage the Russian forces as close to the border as he could, defeat them, and then move back. His soldiers carried 14 days' rations. Unfortunately, the Russians didn't cooperate. They fought a war of attrition. They backed away from the battles and caused him to go deeper and deeper into Russia.
By mid-September, Napoleon had reached an abandoned Moscow. Tsar Alexander kept him there another month with phony peace negotiations to delay him for the onset of winter. On October 18th, Napoleon realized it was high time to leave and commenced his retreat from Moscow. But the legendary Russian winter was early that year. The ground was soon frozen solid. Troops had only summer uniforms and nothing to eat. Thousands died every day. By the time Napoleon left Russia, only 20,000 men remained of the original 600,000-man army. Very few were killed in battle. Most froze to death or died from disease and starvation caused by the hostile weather. Many deserted.
They had passed the plateau where they were interested in being part of the French army. They were interested in survival, and as individuals just wandered away from the column to try and get out of the cold.
The Russians, with inferior weapons and numbers, had achieved victory by playing the only ace at their disposal, a murderous winter. This proved infinitely more ravaging than any numbers of men or weapons they could have brought to the fight. Winter battles fought in the post-industrial age would follow this same pattern. Those who could survive and embrace the destructive force of frozen weather would triumph, and those who underestimated its strength and were caught unprepared would inevitably perish.
During the Soviet invasion of Finland, 10,000 Red Army soldiers were evacuated as a result of severe frostbite. The Finnish army also suffered from a high number of frostbite cases, a reported 5,000 in January 1940. Modern marvels will return in a moment. It's the most treacherous route in the history of trucking.
There really isn't a question of if you're going to fall in, it's when you're going to fall in.
They drive over frozen lakes to keep Arctic towns supplied and to keep themselves alive. Ice Road Truckers on Modern Marvels, tonight at 9, only on the History Channel. We now return to Winter Warriors.
World War I, fought from 1914 to 1918, was the first industrial war. It was fought largely in the trenches. Soldiers stood for long periods in cold, muddy water.
They began to get a disease which was called trench foot, and this is a non-freezing cold injury. Now, trench foot doesn't kill you unless you get infected, but trench foot can put you in a hospital for 2 months until your feet heal.
In the first year of the war, the British Army suffered 115,000 cases of trench foot due to cold weather. It wasn't until 1919, a year after the end of World War I, that the Allies regrouped to travel into Russia. Here, they encountered the full impact of a hostile winter climate.
The U.S., the British, and the French took an expedition into Archangel and Murmansk in Russia to protect the supplies that were there, and became engaged with the Soviet forces.
It was an early experiment to have mobile winter warfare, and they discovered that the warrior they were fighting was not the enemy, but the cold.
Temperatures 33 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit taxed the troops. Inability to move across country. The British tried to train skiers and had actually a unit put together of skiers, but they lost 160 individuals from frostbite and a minimal number, 10 or 15, through combat.
The Allies were at a disadvantage, fighting away from home, ill-prepared for the ordeal. Ironically, the Russians would repeat this mistake on foreign soil in the Russo-Finnish War at the beginning of World War II in 1939.
The Russians invaded Finland and had a far superior army in terms of technology and numbers, and yet the Finnish, who were well versed and trained in extreme cold weather operations and were highly mobile on skis, and then just conducted guerrilla warfare ambushes.
They attacked the campfires and the kitchens of the Russians to try and move them away from their nutrition. They understood how to fight a winter warfare and that the Russians had forgotten.
At first, the Finns were able to stave off the Russian attack, but they were soon overwhelmed by sheer numbers. The Russian army's experience in Finland was only a small taste of the devastating winter engagements that were to come. Hitler invaded Russia on June 22, 1941. He expected that with blitzkrieg tactics, he could storm Russia, seize Moscow, and occupy it all before September. Yet when they finally arrived outside Moscow in December, the German army found itself no match for the harshest winter in 150 years. Tanks, weapons, and other mechanical devices were less than useless. German equipment that was precision-made quickly malfunctioned or shattered from the cold. Yet it wasn't just the Germans who suffered at the mercy of the brutal weather. Troops on both sides found themselves trapped in a bitter struggle for survival. They were the pawns of Hitler and Stalin, two of the most merciless leaders ever locked in battle. Hundreds of thousands of people died every month that winter. By the winter of 1942, the Germans had issued a cold weather handbook for troops to try to ensure survival and effective combat. This information was hard-earned, but could not prepare them for the siege of Stalingrad, fought in sub-zero temperatures and without any food to survive. The Russians won the siege of Stalingrad, but 2 million people had died in 5 freezing months, many of them innocent civilians, trapped in the starving city. The invincible Russian winter had claimed its victims, once more making a mockery of those who underestimated its strength. Meanwhile, halfway around the world, the U.S. Army found itself dragged into a campaign fought in the hostile climate of the Aleutians. Suddenly, the undefended 5,000-mile-long Alaskan coastline, which faced possible invasion from the Pacific, became of huge strategic importance. Only the native Alaskan Eskimos were capable of thriving in this forbidding climate. Bred as warriors for thousands of years, the ice and snow were their natural home. They knew how to survive in storms and live off the land. Major Marvin Muktuk Marston knew of the Eskimos' warrior spirit and saw their huge potential value in winter warfare. He immediately began to form an Alaskan Territorial Guard. At this time, Alaska had not yet achieved statehood.
Marston would say, the governor of Alaska and the president of the United States have asked me to ask you to become one of Uncle Sam's men. Pearl Harbor has been bombed. They have bombed Dutch Harbor. We cannot watch the coast. If we issue you a rifle, Can you help us?
Almost to the man, every village would sign up, from young boys to men in their 80s.
I joined the ATG when I was 13 years old. First thing I got was a rifle and 20 rounds of ammo.
Even women were called to arms.
Their primary job was not to be trained as U.S. soldiers, but because of their native intelligence of spotting everything that was out of place on a all-white terrain, they were there to be scouts.
Some native Alaskans were also recruited directly into the U.S. Army. A small band of them entered the 297th Infantry of the Alaskan Guard and became known as Kastner's Cutthroats. They were legendary for their hell-raising characters, independence, and knowledge of the land.
They were a reconnaissance and intelligence collection unit that was formed by Colonel Kastner, who was the intelligence officer for the Alaska Defense Command. And he went and recruited old Alaskan hands, fishermen, Alaska natives, people who are used to working outdoors.
On June 8, 1942, the Japanese landed forces on the islands of Kiska and Attu in the Aleutian Chain. This was the first occupation of the North American continent since 1812, and a campaign was immediately launched to retake them. Kastner's Cutthroats were sent in ahead of the main troops to scout the Japanese positions.
Extremely dangerous mission. They were going through mountain passes which were covered up with snow and everything. And they were not supposed to really make contact with the enemy. They were just supposed to find out where the Japanese were located.
Buck Delketti spent 5 days and nights with no campfire staking out the Japanese, living on dried food until the main troops landed.
The infantry came running ashore with fixed bayonets, and here we were trying to stop them. There were some of them 4 or 5 feet away from us before we recognized we were in the army, you know.
Good intelligence was not the only thing the 7th Infantry troops who landed on the islands were lacking. They had been destined for service in the desert terrain of North Africa, but had been transferred to Alaska and were totally unprepared for the cold. For every soldier injured in battle, another succumbed to frostbite.
They lost somewhere in the neighborhood of 300 people to frostbite and frozen feet because the troops were just all pooped out. Rather than take care of themselves, they climbed in that sleeping bag, and of course that did it.
In the emergency of war, there had been little time to prepare for the surprise Japanese invasion. The American troops fell victim to the freezing weather, but still managed to reclaim the islands. In Europe, in the winter of 1944 at the Battle of the Bulge, an elite group of paratroopers would suffer a similar fate, rushing ill-prepared to the front lines under desperate conditions.
For their service in World War II, the Alaskan Territorial Guardsmen, the original Eskimo Scouts, were issued a distinctive blue patch with the stars of the Big Dipper. Winter Warriors will be right back.
In December 1944, the Battle of the Bulge was fought in Belgium in the coldest winter of the century in Central Europe. By this stage of World War II, Hitler was trapped on 3 fronts, by the Russians on one flank and by the Allies on 2 others.
He had nowhere to go at this point. He felt he had to concentrate all forces on one desperate, smashing counterattack. And that, for him, looking at his battle maps, had to be in the Ardennes, which is in eastern Belgium. That was a porous part of the Allied line. No one thought that Hitler would attack in the middle of winter in the midst of a thick forest with icy roads.
Hitler attacked in force, stealing the element of surprise. The Allies scrambled to defend themselves, desperately trying to hold their positions with all divisions on all fronts. The 551st, a small elite paratrooper battalion of only 800 men, famed for their ability to steal behind enemy lines, were immediately sent to a small region near the German garrison of Rochellenbau, on the most vulnerable position on the northern shoulder. Their can-do attitude was legendary. They were just what the situation required. There was no time to arrange an airdrop. They marched towards the front in the heavy snow.
We just come from the mountains where we had endured 7 months of mountain fighting, and we had our summer uniforms. I found a couple of dead Americans, and I took off their clothes and put on our clothes.
We were bivouacked in barns, and I remember that morning a sergeant from the 30th Division came up with a trailer, and he had a 55-gallon drum full of hot water and sea rations. And that was about the 20th of December, and I don't recall having a hot meal after that.
The 551 got across the mouth of the bulge just in an unbelievable fashion. They joined us just about Christmas Day.
It would be the coldest Christmas the survivors would ever remember, with temperatures dropping to -7 degrees.
There were portions of turkey brought up and served in the chow line out in the field. And I remember some of the guys would take a turkey leg and stick it up in the tree and figure, well, it's freezing weather, so it's not going to go bad, and I'll eat it tomorrow.
At the front, the 551st was immediately sent in for critical probing missions to test the strength of the German defense. Speed was of the essence, and the soldiers' comfort was never an issue.
And some of the men that did have overcoats were ordered to strip them off and leave them so that we could move fast, and eventually we paid for it with the frostbite cases.
The daring raids of the 551st, fought from the 3rd of January onward, were stunningly successful for such a small unit, but impossibly brutal.
They were on a very long front, and every one of these engagements was a do-or-die engagement with very little help from tanks, very little tank help from artillery, and no air support.
For 3 days and approximately 3 nights, we just pushed and pushed. We attacked and attacked. We would gain probably 100, 200 yards, but we'd keep on pushing all the time, and we didn't have time to sleep. Perhaps we were just completely and utterly exhausted.
They battled with every shred of strength they could muster, even waging an historic bayonet charge, the second only such charge in World War II. The darkest hour for the 551st would come on January 7th, 1945. On the evening of the 6th, they were ordered to prepare to attack the occupied town of Rochellenbau, a heavily defended German garrison strategically located on the Germans' last escape route across the Somme River from the Bulge. The 551st leader, Lieutenant Colonel Wood Yerg, knew it was a suicide mission. Over the radio, he begged to have the attack called off.
This was witnessed by 2 of the 551st men. I'm not going anywhere till I get my men something to eat. And I think by that he was saying, eat, artillery, reinforcement, some clothing. They hadn't eaten for 2 or 3 days. And he was told, you're moving out at dawn.
So this battalion, with practically no artillery, no tank support, were looking up a steep, snow-covered slope, maybe 500 to 600 meters to the top of the hill. They worked their way forward. They took tremendous losses.
Dick Durkee led A Company up a steep, narrow path towards the town. 2 German machine guns were aimed straight at their advance.
We led the attack, and men probably knew that they were going to die, and they just said, that's it. We got to do it anyway. And I moved on up and me and Bazooka Man knocked out one machine gun. Then we continued on up and got up to a wall that was just in front of the town. And I said, now we got it made. And I looked back over to my rear, and I looked back, I didn't see my men. I wondered what the heck happened to the men. I thought they were following me. And then I saw my runner, Casanova, and I yelled to him to send up the men. And he yelled back and told me, he said, they're all dead, sir.
That night, the two other companies of the 551st were able to overthrow the German stronghold. Against tremendous odds, Rochlenval was liberated on January 7th.
That action then showed Hitler that all of his troops had been pushed back west of the Somme, and it undoubtedly went into his decision to start the withdrawal. And we take great pride in, in having been a part of that.
The 551st paid an enormous price for this exceptional victory. After such a severe mauling, the small battalion was disbanded. But their heroic efforts, fighting both the Germans and freezing conditions, were offered in sacrifice to stem Hitler's advance. An incredible spirit united the 551st to continue in the face of adversity.
They did their job, and they did it bravely because they were mentally conditioned to withstand those hardships. But it's awful wonderful for an officer to tell the men, you do this, and realizing that he knows he's going to die. Chances are he's going to die to do it, but they do it with a smile on their face. And that attitude you just can only see in an American soldier.
After World War II, it would not be long before elite American soldiers would find themselves fighting for their lives in another winter battle of epic proportions. On September 15, 1950, during the Korean War, General MacArthur ordered an invasion of South Korea to eject the North Korean army. The U.S. Marines launched an amphibious landing at Incheon that day and moved on triumphantly to retake Seoul. By early November, the 1st Marine Division and regimental combat teams from the Army's 7th Infantry Division had crossed the 38th parallel and were advancing northwards, chasing the remnants of the North Korean army towards the Yalu River and the Chinese border. They had no idea they were entering a trap. In fact, the Marines' only worry was the weather, which was turning bitterly cold the higher they advanced. On the 24th of November, the troops celebrated Thanksgiving in the freezing cold, which was dropping to minus 30 degrees.
And we heard General MacArthur on the Jeep radio giving us Thanksgiving greetings from Tokyo, and he told us we'd all be home by Christmas.
The companies at the head of the advance moved up to the edge of the Chosin Reservoir, which was now a giant expanse of ice.
The first night there, I noticed some activity on a far ridge, and I brought it to the attention of one of our officers. He said, we know about that. They're just some volunteers. Sometime way after dark, they attacked in force.
The 15,000 Marines were suddenly ambushed by a massed force of 60,000 Chinese infantrymen flooding around them. Their orders were to annihilate the Marines and allies down to the very last man.
It took just a short time to figure out no ammunition's going to come forward, no food's going to come forward, we can't get the wounded out, so what do? Pack it up, tighten ourselves into a ball, and move down to the next base camp.
Thus began the historic ordeal of the breakout from the Chosin Reservoir.
It was a singular experience. You were surrounded by other people doing the same thing, but you were in your own private war in one sense.
Isolation and the savage cold forced the soldiers in on themselves. Every second was a struggle for survival. Medics were overwhelmed by casualties.
When they were up on the line, would carry the morphine syringes, just a little one shot. So they'd put these in their mouths and hold them between their teeth and their gums so they wouldn't freeze. So when the wounded man needed them, they could pull them out of their mouth and use them.
When the Chinese attacked, Red Merrill was shot in the upper arm.
My rifle was in my left hand. I had my arm up like this to pull the trigger. And the bullet hit me from the rear, came out the front, and caused a lot of severe nerve damage.
Merrill lost circulation in his right hand, and frostbite was quick to set in.
My fingers were all black from gangrene, and I knew right then I was going to have some serious trouble. At the very least, I'd lose my fingers.
Many times the ice finished what the Chinese had started. The Marines managed to carve an airstrip out of a frozen piece of ground for planes to come in and evacuate the wounded.
As they were taking off of the landing strip, the Chinese mortars and artillery were coming in trying to stop them, so you could see there weren't many people going out of there.
Medics saw case after case of men who'd lost all feeling in their hands and feet.
So he then took my hand and had me look away, and he poked it with my fingers and my toes with a needle or a pin or something like that, and I was supposed to tell him when it hurt. And it wasn't until he got kind of high up into my hand and high up into my foot when I could feel it.
Almost every single Marine suffered from the flawed design of their rubberized boot, the shoe pack, which did not allow for adequate ventilation. Any sweat generated from movement would soon freeze between the toes. The boots were difficult to remove, and frostbite would inevitably set in. It was impossible to eat. Soldiers either had no food at all, or all rations were frozen solid.
By and large, none of us ate for 5 to 10 days. I lost 32 pounds in 1 month up there.
It became so cold that their only thought was their very basic survival. If they would see any form of shelter, they didn't even consider the fact the enemy was over the next hill and might be in there shortly to annihilate them. And unfortunately, the statistics say that did happen.
Occasionally, the clouds would break, allowing aircraft to move in to drop supplies and provide cover for their retreat.
And this one night, we all prayed, let the planes get through, and all of a sudden it opens up. And we really were very grateful for their support. It turned the tide of the battle.
Overcoming tremendous odds, the Marines managed to fight their way down to Hagaru and to the coast, where they were evacuated by boat. The 15,000 Allies that went up to Chosin suffered 12,000 casualties, including over 3,000 killed and 6,000 wounded, plus thousands of severe frostbite cases from the -30-degree temperatures. The Chinese suffered an estimated 43,500 casualties, including 28,000 killed and 15,000 wounded. The night the Marines had prayed and the clouds parted, they had seen a very bright star. This Christmas star would become the emblem of the Survivors Association, known as the Chosin Few because so few men survived. To this day, veterans of the Chosin breakout still remember the horror of the battle in the frozen mountains. Many have suffered amputations of hands or feet. Others have permanent nerve damage and still wear thick socks to bed.
When I got back to the U.S., I couldn't stand to even have a sheet on top of me. I was sleeping at night. My body had adjusted to the cold.
Their collective injuries have demonstrated just how cruel the effects of the cold can be.
The government didn't really pay much attention to cold weather injuries until our Chosin Few organization had a cold weather committee who has worked very hard to change that.
Great lessons were learned at Chosin. Better boots were essential, and soldiers desperately needed a proper cold weather training program, especially if they were to fight in some of the coldest regions known to man.
During the winter of 1915, Germany originated chemical warfare by firing shells charged with Zyl bromide against the Russian army. Due to the harsh Polish winter, the Zyl bromide froze solid in the shells and rendered them futile. Winter Warriors will be right back.
As the Cold War set in Europe after World War II, the Iron Curtain divided East from West. On the northwestern border of the United States, a similar barrier fell through the Bering Strait, separating the Soviet Union from Alaska. Known as the Ice Curtain, it crossed a desolate expanse of water that remained frozen 6 months out of every year.
We were only a few miles from the Soviet Union, and perhaps this was a frontier now rather than Europe in the Cold War. The Russians had a vital interest in this part of the world.
In this highly sensitive region, it was known that the Russians had intelligence bases to spy on the U.S. The U.S. was also very concerned that the Russians were operating submarines along the coastline. As in World War II, the unique skills of the Eskimo Scouts and their intimate knowledge of the Arctic landscape were called upon to defend their borders.
Generally, they had the same job as surveillance, but this time it was looking for lights for Russian submarines, anything unusual going overhead. And they did find flashlight batteries of Russian markings, some survival gear, part of an old rubber life raft.
Operationally, they were very good at what they did. Basically, the Eskimo Scouts up here during the Cold War, they were sort of on the front lines.
The Eskimo Scouts began to help school both Army and Air Force troops in the essentials of Arctic survival and cold weather training. For soldiers new to the -40-degree temperatures, there was a lot to learn.
Now, a lot of those people came up from lower 48, didn't even know how to start a campfire. And you've always kept your matches inside your hat, never in your pocket. If you fall through the ice or fall in the creek, you get soaked and wet, your matches are gone.
Alaskans could live off the land, carrying dried food or hunting whatever animals they could find. American troops new to Alaska had a hard time adapting to this new diet. At the beginning of the Cold War, the Army also began staging winter war games in Alaska, for they knew that if they ever entered an armed conflict with Russia, it could be fought in extremely cold weather. American troops, equipment, and tactics were tested against the Eskimo Scouts. The perfect Arctic soldier, the Scouts ran circles around the Army with their natural stealth and ability to blend into the background.
They would come in, sometimes unseen, and leave little notes to the American soldiers. We were here, where were you? And they'd disappear in the mists again.
Although the Eskimo Scouts are no longer in service, most of their invaluable lessons have been incorporated into the current winter war games known as Northern Edge that operate today in Alaska. Elite troops are committed to the same icy wastes, and their first lesson is to respect this merciless force of Mother Nature. With wind chill, temperatures in the Arctic can drop as low as -80 degrees. Even Rangers, who have run the gauntlet of endurance training, are not prepared for the cold.
There was a certain amount of macho, this is not going to be a big deal, I'm not worried about the cold weather. The day we landed was about 45 below, and as soon as they opened the back of the airplane and the cold air came in, you saw the expressions change.
Drop a soldier off untrained, unequipped, in a cold weather environment in the Arctic. And you're talking about count the hours before you're going to come back and find him being a severe casualty.
Bottom line is, fighting in a true Arctic environment is a very, very difficult proposition across the board. And as a result of that, I think there's a very large impact of morale, and soldier competence and confidence plays a much larger role in who will ultimately succeed in Arctic combat.
They learned that layering clothing is of extreme importance. New fabrics and vapor barrier boots offer the best protection against the cold. They learned that mittens, if removed, will lead to instant frostbite. They learned how to operate weapons differently in sub-zero temperatures.
A lot of them are taught as they put their cheek up to the buttstock of the weapon. In order to get the same sight picture, they put their nose against the charging handle of a weapon. In a cold weather environment, their nose almost becomes an immediate contact frostbite case.
The U.S. Air Force runs an Arctic survival school at Eielson Air Force Base, Alaska, teaching air crews how to hunker down in the ice and snow if they have to bail out over remote territory.
I was actually told before I came here that if I ever had to punch out up here that I was a goner. But actually going through the course and really kind of knowing what I got at my disposal, I'm pretty confident that I could make it on the ground, set myself up for at least a day or two waiting for a pickup.
Students learn many survival skills from experts, like laying out signals using their parachutes.
V is going to stand out for I need help, pretty much. X, need medical assistance.
They learn that building a snow shelter can mean the difference between life and death.
Where it'll be minus 20 degrees outside, it's 20 degrees inside. And you can survive a long time, you know, even at 20 degrees, and you're outside of the area where frostbite's going to be more of a hazard. 40-degree difference, just using snow as a shelter.
They learn how to set snares to catch a meal if their rations run out.
We give our students flagging tape so that way it sticks out, so I can keep track. And you want to constantly make sure you check these things because nothing hurts the motivation and morale of survival than coming up to your snare, not being able to locate it, or coming up to it and find out another animal's already beat you to it and you fed it a free meal.
A lot has been learned since the early winter wars where Napoleon sacrificed his grand army to the Russian winter. Today's troops who are stationed in freezing regions around the globe are better prepared. But this knowledge has come at a tremendous price. Previous winter battles decimated entire armies. Those soldiers who did triumph displayed extraordinary courage and endurance. The survivors of the small 551st Paratrooper Battalion who fought so bravely at the Battle of the Bulge, and whose history has been largely obscured for over 50 years, were finally singled out for their exceptional service. In May 2000, they were awarded a Presidential Unit Citation for their bravery. This is only the second time since World War II that such a citation has ever been retroactively awarded. The Marines in Korea were also given a Presidential Unit Citation directly after their heroic breakout from the Chosin Reservoir. They were honored for decisively defeating 7 enemy divisions, together with elements of 3 others. The doomed plight of these soldiers records some of the most grueling campaigns that were ever waged. As every winter warrior knows, no enemy is more merciless or more formidable than Mother Nature.